Okay, so here we are in Chapter 3. Chapter 3 is on economic growth. This is the first lecture. And as usual, I've got some a video for you and a little bit something from the Wall Street Journal. Now, one of the purposes of me doing what I do here at the very beginning of the lecture is I'm trying to bring in as much as possible current events, because really the whole purpose of this course is that when you read something or listen to something concerning the economy, you can relate to it. You can understand what is happening, and you perhaps got some opinions about it. I mean, this is what education is all about. Your education is that you become more aware of the world around you, and hopefully that'll enable you to make better decisions for yourself. But there's a news program that I listen to a lot. It's called RT. I think R stands for Russia because it's a Russian program, but it's all in English. But I find that it's got some excellent news programs, and there's several on this website, rt.com, but the one I listen to the most is Boom and Bust, because they always talk about economic stuff. And this is the one from yesterday. Now, what I'm going to do, and the reason I'm showing you this, and then I've got an article from the Wall Street, is that you may read something like you can listen to this website, this program on the web, and it's going to present one viewpoint. And then I'm going to show you an article from the Wall Street Journal, and that's going to show you another viewpoint. But if you don't know that there are two different viewpoints out there, then it would be very confusing, because you read one article and it says one thing and makes you think one way, and then you read another article and it says something else that makes you think, well, this is not the same as, and so what's the deal here? And so that's really what I'm trying to point out to you. So let's just listen to this for a few minutes, and maybe you get an idea of what I'm talking about.
The Labour Party elected its most leftist leader in at least 30 years, with analysts calling it a decisive shift away from the free market policies that once defined the party under Tony Blair. Now, over the weekend, the Labour Party announced that Jeremy Corbyn, a by and large fringe figure in British politics, had been elected its new leader. He has been widely thought of as an outsider, but 3 months ago, he decided to join the race to succeed Ed Miliband, who, of course, you may remember, resigned after the party's huge defeat back in the general election in May. Not only did he win, he won by a pretty sizable margin. Corbyn secured 59.5% of the vote. That's compared to his closest rival, Andy Burnham, who gained just 19%. Here's a look at what he had to say just after that win, speaking to supporters.
Above all, open your hearts and open your minds and open your attitude towards supporting people who are desperate, who need somewhere safe to live, want to contribute to our society, and are human beings just like all of us. Together in peace, together in justice, together in humanity. That surely must be our way forward.
A large margin of support given to Corbyn is somewhat surprising, considering how leftist his platform really is. The Labour leader-elect says he wants to end Britain's austerity spending cuts, which he says have damaged the UK's recovery from the Great Recession. In the past, he's also talked about renationalizing Britain's railroad system and energy companies, abolishing tuition for British universities, and mandating the Bank of England to print money for investment in huge infrastructure projects. His platform is so left-leaning that analysts have said it even goes beyond the left-wing framework policies constructed by American political leader Bernie Sanders, who's a U.S. senator and is running for president in 2016. That said,
so obviously, what viewpoint is this? This is looking at things through the eyes of Keynes. This is, Keynesian economics. All right, the idea that as long as we can manage demand, which would be we meaning government, as long as government can manage demand, then we can manage the economy. All right. So again, just one viewpoint. Now, for the other viewpoint, there's an article in today's Wall Street Journal, and if you read the Wall Street, what I would suggest you doing is you open up the paper. See, this would be the beginning of the paper here, and I always open up the second to the last page, which is these two pages are the opinion pages. Now, of course, what does opinion mean? Well, that means that this is opinion of who's ever writing the article, and on the left there'd be opinions of the Wall Street Journal, and on the right would be opinions of individuals who have written into the Wall Street Journal. So keep that in mind, if you read this, that these are opinions, but I found it very thought-provoking, probably one of the best sources of news, and which has enabled my understanding more than maybe anything else. But anyway, there's an article here. It said, if only the Fed would get out of the way. Well, right away, what kind of opinion is this? Austrian, right? Okay, the Fed should get out of the way. In other words, we instead of the Federal Reserve, which is our central bank, intervening in the monetary markets, that the free market should dictate interest rates. Okay, now that is that is definitely an Austrian point of view. Okay, so we got two different points of view here. Let me just read to just a little bit here. It said, in their theory of business cycles, the Austrian economists Ludwig van Mises and Friedrich Hayek. Now, see, if you didn't take this course and you read this, you'd say, well, what's the Austrian school? Who's Friedrich Hayek, right? So again, it's education. Friedrich Hayek explained several decades ago that artificially cheap credit misleads entrepreneurs and investors into doing the wrong things, which in the current financial context includes making unsustainable levered investments. Now, what does that mean, levered investments? Well, that comes from the word leverage, and as you recall, leverage is when you for example, if you put money into savings and then use that money to invest in the stock market, that's not leverage because you're using your own money. But if you borrow money, see, other people had to work in order to save so that you could borrow that money. So when you borrow money to invest in the stock market, then you are using leverage because it's not your effort that has generated this income, but it's other people's efforts who has generated the income that you use to invest. You see the difference? You save, you use your savings to invest in the stock market, that's not leverage because it was your effort. When you borrow money and invest in the stock market, that's using leverage because you're taking advantage of other people's efforts rather than your own. Y'all with me on this? Okay, so again, that's really the point that I'm trying to make here, so that when you read things like this, you've got, you get some, what they're saying. You got some knowledge that will enable you to understand what's happening. Yeah, you got a question?
No, I'm good.
No. Okay, which the current financial context includes making unsustainable levered investments in risky assets, including companies loading up on debt to buy back and boost the price of their stock. So see, why has the stock market gone up so much in the past, in the last several years? Because the Federal Reserve has kept interest rates so low that investors have savers, instead of putting money in the savings account, they put money in the stock market. It's also encouraged companies to borrow money, because essentially you can borrow money for free. So you can use leverage with no cost to yourself if interest rates are close to zero. So companies can borrow money, which is free money. They can buy their own stock. Their stock goes up. Let's say it goes up 10%. Well, if they didn't pay any money to borrow, and yet the price of stock has gone up 10%, well, that's a win-win situation. All right? So that's what they're talking about here, which in the current financial context includes making unsustainable, because you can't do this forever, levered investments in risky assets like the stock market, including companies loading up on debt to buy back and boost the price of their stock. Low interest rates may create the illusion of robust markets, but eventually rates spike, which means they go up. Assets are suddenly revealed to be highly priced, too high priced, because it was a result of a bubble, and debt's unpayable. See, when you encourage more and more debt, eventually that debt becomes unsustainable, and once the economy heads south, and you've got this dominoes effect. You know, person A can't pay person B can't pay person A, and then the whole thing, the collapse builds upon itself. Many firms have to cut back production. Okay, just one more thing here. The U.S. stock market rose with each new wave of QE. Capital Q, capital E. Well, what's QE? QE stands for quantitative easing. And what is quantitative easing? Quantitative easing is when the Federal Reserve creates money and then buys securities or bonds and sometimes other assets with this newly created money. That's quantitative easing. That's how we've kept interest rates close to zero, because when you increase the supply of anything, then the price relative to demand, the price goes down, and the price of borrowed money is interest. So if we increase the supply of money, then that will lower the price of money, which is interest. And that's how we have kept interest rates close to zero, because in the past several years, the Federal Reserve, which is the only institution that can create money, by the way, and at least in America, the government can't, but the Federal Reserve can, by creating money out of thin air, because nothing backs up our money. We have what is called a fiat monetary system. Then you increase the supply of money, the price of money goes down, and that's how we lower interest rates. All right? Anyway, that's what quantitative easing is. And it's a grand experiment, and an Austrian would say that it's an experiment that is doomed to failure, where a Keynesian would support quantitative easing as a monetary policy. So again, you know, two different viewpoints. Yeah, there's a question back there? Yeah.
Aren't they deciding tomorrow whether or not they're going to raise the rates? The Reserve, aren't they supposed to decide? Isn't there a decision expected at like 2 o'clock tomorrow or something?
Oh, yeah, that's a good point you're making. Yeah, the main reason why this article is in today's paper is that the Federal Reserve does meet today, in fact, today and tomorrow. And every time the Board of Governors meets of the Federal Reserve, and a lot of this I know it's hard for you to understand because, well, we have a whole chapter coming up on just, you know, money and banking, and we talk about the Federal Reserve, and so, you know, I mean, we go into these things in detail, and you understand it a lot. So if you don't understand it now, then you know you will later on. Yeah, the Federal Reserve is meeting today and tomorrow, and every time they meet, there's an expectation that they will say, well, we're no longer going to engage in quantitative easing, and we're going to take steps that will begin to raise interest rates. Okay. Now, whether they do or not, I mean, would only be. We'll find out within the next couple of days. But when they make decisions like this, it has a big impact on investors. Big impact is really, whether they do or don't affects decisions all over the world, really. Now, of course, one thing you want to keep in mind is that who would be the biggest loser if interest rates were going to increase? Well, who has the biggest debt? And the answer is the federal government. With the federal government's debt so huge that any small increase in interest rates translates into hundreds of millions of extra dollars in interest payments. So the federal government is not in favor of higher interest rates because it'd be too expensive for them. So that's something you want to think about. Yeah, another question?
Yeah, I don't see how quantitative easing has an effect on interest rates.
Okay, the question is, what effect does quantitative easing has on interest rates? What quantitative easing means is that we create. Now, that word create, it's a very misused term in our society, but if you look up the definition, to create means to make something from nothing. Okay? Now, everything that we see in this room was not created, but we took the raw material and made it into what we have, chairs and doors and computers and like that. So you see, man, the only thing man, us, can create is money. Okay? So we can create money out of virtually thin air, out of nothing. And that's what we do. Because nothing backs up our money, then we can create it as much as we want. So when you create the supply of anything, as it becomes easier to come by, there's less competition because there's more for everybody, and the price goes down. Now, the next chapter coming up here, and this is chapter 3, but chapter 4, we have a whole chapter on just demand and supply. So you have a better understanding of why an increase in supply will lower the price, at least when supply increases relative to demand. But so it's hard for me to explain these things in detail since we're really at the beginning, of this course. We're just, starting chapter 3 today. But that's what it is. When you increase the supply of anything, it's easier to come by. There's less competition, like at an auction. There's less competition, so there's less incentive for people to bid against one another to bid the price up. So prices, the more you increase the supply of something, the price is low. And interest is simply the price we pay to borrow money. When you go to the bank and you say, I want to borrow money, well, the price that you pay for that borrowed money is the interest that you would pay. Yeah, I don't know. Does that help?
So, like, if a bunch of people have money and then some people haven't, they will charge them for borrowing money to make it even.
No, all interest rates go up and down together. I mean, if an interest rate, well, what you might be getting at here is that if you've got a good credit rating, yes, then when you go to the bank, you can borrow money at a lower interest rate than someone that has a bad credit rating. That's why your credit report is so important, because that's why these loan companies make so much money, because only people with bad credits go to a loan company, and loan companies charge very, very high interest rates to compensate them for the higher risk they're taking when they lend money to someone that has a poor credit history. Does that help?
Wait, so do the interest rates go down with quantitative easing?
Yeah, interest rates go down with quantitative easing, exactly. That's why interest rates, see, if the free market would determine interest rates, they would be much higher than they are today. But we don't have a free market in our banking. It's controlled by government and the Federal Reserve, and so the Federal Reserve is artificially keeping interest rates down close to zero. See, they're trying to make the market do things that it wouldn't normally do, and that's why Austrians would be against this, because Austrians are more in favor of the free market, whereas Keynesians are less in favor of the free market and more in favor of government control. I don't know, does that help?
So the reverse is true then. By making the supply of money more scarce, it's going to make it harder to come by, and therefore interest rates will be higher.
Yeah, sure. And the question here is that if we make money less scarce, I'm sorry, more scarce, yes. If we make money more scarce, harder to come by, then interest rates will go up. Yeah, it's all supply and demand. Yeah. Any other questions? It's great that I get questions. How about over there in Dublin? Any questions over there? I
have one.
Yeah.
If your economy is looking to switch from, say, Canadian to Austrian, that goes through election is how you would eventually be able to switch from one genre to another, correct?
Well, actually, you kind of hit the nail on the head here, all right? I mean, if y'all understand his question is that, see, we live in a democracy. And so people's understanding of things go a long way into government policy. And if the majority of people don't understand how the economy really works, then they can vote for policies that will really hurt them instead of help them, because they don't understand it. So yes, I mean, definitely. I mean, that's really, I mean, that question goes to the heart of this whole course. I mean, that's really the whole point here, because you all, are the millennial generation, and you're the ones who control the future. Not my generation, but it's your generation that will control what will happen in the future. But if you don't understand how the world works, then bad things can happen, and either you won't know why, or you'll support policies that are really contrary to your well-being. Yeah, that was an excellent question. Anything else? Any other questions?
It's just quantitative easing.
Quantitative easing.
Quantitative easing, similar to what the Weimar Germany did that caused the economic problems before the rise of the Third Reich. Like the wheelbarrows of cash.
Yeah, well, yeah. Now we again, we're going to discuss this later, but this is not the first time. I mean, history has a tendency to repeat itself. Yes, this is exactly what the Weimar Republic did back in the 20s. Is that they increased the money supply to pay for the debts of, well, we're getting off into it now, but the Versailles Peace Treaty after World War I forced Germany to pay for all the war damage in the Allied countries, and so Germany simply created money to pay those war debts, and this brought about huge increases in inflation, which destroyed the economy even further. I mean, in addition to the World War I, and these conditions allowed Adolf Hitler to come to power through legitimate democratic elections, all legal. Yeah. See all this. See, if you understand the things that we're talking about here, see, that's one reason why I like economics. I mean, personally, it's a little history and psychology, and I mean, there's a whole lot that psychology, a whole lot that goes into it. Anyway, we better get to this chapter 3 here on economic growth. And I've mentioned this before. Why is growth important? And the answer is because things wear out. If we don't replace today what we have, will we have today, will we have tomorrow what we have today? And the answer is no. If we don't continually replace what we have today, then tomorrow we end up with less. Why? Because things deteriorate, things wear out. As time goes on, things wear out. So if we don't replace, we have less and less and less. So in order to grow, it's necessary to replace not only what we have today, but grow to the extent that we have more tomorrow than we do today. But growth is not an option. If we don't grow, then we end up with less and less and less, which intensifies the economic problem, or especially the distribution problem, because if society has to decide who gets what and how much, well, if there's less for everybody, that intensifies the allocation problem of who's going to get and who's not going to get. See, very few things can you state in the absolute. But this is one where I believe you can state in the absolute. It is if we grow sufficiently, then it's possible for everyone to gain. But if we fail to grow, then the average person will suffer. I can't think of a more absolute statement than that one. If absolute growth or is relative growth important? Relative growth is more important because a decline in the rate of growth could precipitate an increase in unemployment. In other words, most of us could walk from here to Radford, correct? But how many of us could run from here to Radford, which is 10 miles, whether we're in Dublin or here at the mall, it's about 10 miles. Well, few of us could run 10 miles. Now here's the point. What is the best kind of growth? Well, the best kind of growth is a slow but steady growth. Why? Because a slow and steady growth, just like walking, can be maintained. Whereas if you have fast growth, it's difficult to maintain that quick rate of growth. And what economics teaches us is that what causes unemployment is the slowdown in the rate of growth. In other words, if we grow 10% one year, which would be a phenomenal growth, especially for America, and we grow 8% next year, you might say, well, 8% is still a fantastic rate of growth. Yeah, but it's less than this year, and that's all that's necessary to bring about more unemployment. What causes unemployment is a decline, not in the absolute rate of growth, but in the relative rate of growth. What's important is relative growth more than absolute growth. Okay? So here is just a picture. Economists love to draw pictures. Often what happens is that an economist, an econ professor like myself will make a statement, and you might understand it, and then I'll say, well, let me draw you a picture of it, and then I draw you a picture, and then it confuses you. That sometimes happens. But anyway, economists love to use pictures. They love to draw graphs. And so here's a graph in economic growth. You see, here we got consumer goods on the vertical axis, capital goods on the horizontal axis. Capital goods are as you recall, or goods that we produce to produce other goods. You know, like if we produce a machine or a factory, that would be a capital good. And of course, consumer goods are the things that you and I buy at the retail store. But see, if we increase productivity, then we can push out what is called the production possibilities curve, or F would stand for frontier, the production possibilities frontier, so that it's possible for everyone to have more. Now, whether everyone has more depends on society and how they distribute, you know, the income, but it's possible. That's why we call this production possibilities frontier. But if you increase productivity, we can push out the production possibilities frontier. And of course, if we don't grow and things wear out, this is what can happen. The production possibilities frontier will move to the left. It will shrink as time goes on. See, remember, nothing stays in a state of suspended animation. Either it's growing or dying. Either we're moving forward or we're moving backward. But nothing in this life stands still. How can we increase GDP? Stands for gross domestic product. Now, gross domestic product, if you read the book, and I'm, in my lectures, I don't go into great detail on these things because that's what the book is all about. What I try to do in my lectures is I try to give you the overview, the summary, and I try to show you how point A relates to point B and point B relates to point C. So in the book you can read more in detail about gross domestic product, but gross domestic product is the dollar value of all new and final goods and services produced in the country in any one year. And the gross domestic product is the primary way that we use to measure economic growth. Because that's what gross domestic product is. I mean, if we have something that's new and final this year that we didn't have last year, then that represents economic growth. Assuming that something is purchased by somebody, because there has to be a market transaction. So what is the Austrian view of growth? The Austrian view of growth is that we save, people save, they work, earn money, they save, and then that money, people who invest borrow that money, and they make wise investments with it. And if they do that, then that's how we can best grow the economy. Saving, by the way, remember in economics, we have very definite definitions. And the definition of savings is money earned but not spent. See, for example, when you pay taxes, you may not have control of that money, but by definition, that's money that you have saved. If you earn $1, but you got to pay that $1 in taxes, well, what is that? You earned $1, but you didn't spend it, so that's savings. It may be forced savings. You may not have any control over it, but it's still savings according to the definition. All right? So definitions are very important in economics. Now, what is the Keynesian view of growth? Stimulate demand. See, two different viewpoints. One, Austrian, save, investors borrow that money, invest it in good investments, grows the economy. Keynesian view, it's more demand oriented. See, as we call with Austrian, it's from the inside out. It's first you save, and then people voluntarily in a free market, borrow this money and make investments. See, that's sort of an inside out approach to growth. Whereas the Keynesian view is more from the top down. It's a top down approach. So that in order to stimulate the economy, we can stimulate demand, and government can take actions one way or another to stimulate demand, either their own demand or consumer demand or investment demand. See, what type of growth is best? And I already mentioned this, slow but steady. Is it reasonable to believe we can eliminate slumps? Keynesians would say yes. Austrians tend to believe that slumps are inevitable. This is one of the major differences between Austrians and Keynesians. Okay, Austrians say that, well, just as people, I mean, it's normal for people to get sick once in a while. It's unreasonable to think that you can be born and live for 80, 90 years and never get sick. I mean, that's unrealistic. And Austrians would say, well, that's what the economy is like. The economy is just it's biological. It's like a big person, and we're all just a part of that big person. And just as people get sick, well, economies get sick, and that's just the natural flow of things. Whereas the Keynesians would not tolerate slumps like Austrians would. A Keynesian would say, "Oh well, we got to do something here. I mean, this is not good. We're going into a slump. This is not good. We got to do something. We got to stimulate demand to get out of this slump." See, that would be a Keynesian view. Austrians would say, "Well, sure, okay, things are on the downswing now, but that's the market will correct itself, and eventually we'll get. I mean, that's just the natural flow of things. That's life." See, two different viewpoints. How do we measure growth? And I've already talked about this. Gross domestic product, new and final. New means something. Well, we got it this year. We didn't have it last year. A final good. See, there are final goods and there are intermediate goods. Like, we can go to the forest and cut down trees, and then we can take those trees to the lumber mill, and we can make 2x4s out of those trees. But that does not increase gross domestic product. Why? Well, because those 2x4s are not a final product. What does that mean? Well, what that means is we didn't go to the forest to cut down trees to make 2x4s in order to have 2x4s. So, in other words, to have lumber. What was the whole purpose of cutting down the trees to begin with? Well, the whole purpose was to make lumber so that we could build houses with that lumber. See, the house was the final product. The lumber was the intermediate good. So if we're going to measure, are we better off this year than last year? Well, we don't concern ourselves with intermediate goods. We only look at final goods. We don't look at the lumber, but we look at the house that we built with the lumber. Yeah.
Yeah, but does somebody have to buy the house?
Well, yes, that's a good point. That's excellent question. His question was, does someone have to buy the house? And the answer is absolutely yes. See, we can go to the woods, cut trees, make lumber out of that, build a house with it. But if no one buys the house, then it's just a big piece of wood standing somewhere. I mean, it has no value to society unless someone purchases it. So yes, in economics, in order for us to consider it, there has to be a market transaction. So that was an excellent question. Yeah. See, what is new and final? Okay, again, I've already just explained this. What are examples of new and final? Lumber, and I just talked about this. See, I get ahead of myself on these slides. When is measuring GDP useful? If we measure real GDP from one year to the next over a span of time, we can know where we are going and how fast we're going there. Real GDP. All right, let's say that we measure that from year 1 to year 2, GDP's increased by 5%. But from year 1 to year 2, inflation was 5%. So when we measure GDP and we get a 5% higher figure, does that mean that we're 5% better off? And the answer is no, because there's a difference between money GDP and real GDP. The word real in front of anything means that we have adjusted this figure for inflation. So in other words, if we measure GDP and we measure a 5% growth rate, but inflation in that same time period is 5%, then what we would say is that money, and sometimes we use the word nominal, either money or nominal, same means the same thing. We would say that nominal GDP is zero, has not changed. That we have this year what we had last year. No, did I say it? I said that wrong. Let me go over that again. I got so caught up with with nominal and money that I lost my train of thought. If GDP is 5% more this year than last year, but inflation's 5%, then nominal GDP or money GDP is increased by 5%, but real GDP has not increased. See, because considering inflation, we're no better off this year than we were last year. So money figures don't give us a true picture of what's happening. We have to adjust these figures for inflation in order to get a true picture of what's happening. So when you see the word real in front of any term, that means that we have adjusted this figure for inflation. See, what is real and money? Again, I got ahead of myself. Money GDP is not adjusted for inflation. Real GDP factors out the variable of inflation. Okay. Once we calculate real GDP from year to year, how do we calculate the percent increase or decrease? Now, I'm going to show you this, but I'm trying to give you the bigger picture. Why do we measure GDP in the first place? Because we want to know where we're going and how fast we're going there. See, we want to know, well, are things getting better or are things getting worse? Now, which economist would spend more time calculating and being concerned with gross domestic product? And the answer is a Keynesian. You know, I mean, if Keynesians are all caught up with statistics and measuring things. Why? Well, because if we're going someplace that we don't want to be going, if we know enough facts, we can adjust our government policies to better the situation. Now, an Austrian would say, well, yeah, it's good to know, if things are getting better or getting worse, but they don't put as much weight on GDP because an Austrian would rely more on market forces. They're not so quick to jump in and do something. All right? So once we calculate real GDP from year to year, again, real meaning we've taken into consideration inflation, how do we calculate percent increase or decrease? Well, we take the difference between two numbers and divide by the original number. Now, this is just mathematics. You see, I just mentioned to you that economics is a little bit of sociology, psychology, history, and it's a little bit of mathematics. And so, for example, if we go from 3 to 5, that would be a 67% increase, because the way that we calculate a percent increase or decrease is that you take the difference between the two numbers and then you divide by the original number. So 3 here is the original number. So the difference between 3 and 5 is 2. And 2 divided by 3 is 67. So if we go from 3 to 5, that's a 67% increase. Now, you're not going to have to do a lot of calculations here. In fact, I don't know if you have to do any. Now, in microeconomics, and I just spent time with a student with some mathematical problems in microeconomics, you will use this mathematics quite a bit. But macro is different than micro. And in macroeconomics, we don't get, we don't do a lot of mathematical computations. But this is one that generally you should know how to do. That a percent increase is the difference between two numbers divided by the original numbers. Just as if we go from 5 to 3, now in this case, what's the original number? Well, it's 5, not 3. So, but again, the difference is 2, but because the original number is 5, the percent decrease is 40%, because it's 2 divided by 5, which would be 40%. So 3 to 5 is a 67% increase, but from 5 down to 3 is only a 40% decrease, mathematically. This is strictly mathematics. So, see, what we do is if we spend hundreds of millions of dollars and we hire a team of economists to calculate gross domestic product in any one year, that would be absolutely worthless information. Why is it worthless information? Because the whole point to GDP is to give us an idea of, are things getting better or are things getting worse? So if we know what GDP is for 1 year, well, what good does that do? It doesn't tell us anything. But if we calculate gross domestic product for year 1, and then year 2, and then year 3, and then year 4, and then year 5, you see? So we get a string of gross domestic products from year to year, and we adjust each of those figures for inflation so that we're looking at real GDP and not money GDP. And then we use this very simple mathematical computation to calculate the percent increase or decrease over several years, from year to year. Then we can look at these statistics, and it gives us some important information. So that's all I'm going to say about gross domestic product. So what is the rule of man? Now again, this chapter is on economic growth. So what we're talking about here are factors that either will grow the economy or inhibit growth. And so all of these things that we talk about are dealing with economic growth. What is the rule of man? The practice of putting oneself above the law when one has the authority to do so. And what is the rule of law? There is a respect and adherence to the law and secure property rights. For example, let's say that you're speeding in a 40 mile per hour zone. Let's say you're going 65 miles an hour, and a policeman stops you and says, I clocked you going 65 in a 40 mile per hour zone, and I'm going to give you a ticket. And according to the ticket, you're going to have to pay X amount of dollars in fines, and perhaps go to court. Now, that is the rule of law. Now, let's take another scenario. You're driving in a 40 mile per hour zone. You're going 40 miles per hour, and you're stopped by a policeman, and he says, I'm going to give you a ticket for going 65 miles per hour. Now, this may be uncommon in America, but those of you that are from another country, you can maybe relate to this more, because this is more common in other parts of the world. But what's going to happen here is that the policeman is looking for a bribe. See, in other words, the ticket may cost you $300, but if you give him $100, he'll say, well, he'll forget about giving you a ticket. Now, does the policeman have the authority to do this? I mean, can he not give you a ticket, or can he decide to give you the ticket? And it's just your word against his word. Well, he's got the authority to do that, correct? So if a policeman does this because he's expecting a bribe, then that what is called the rule of man. The rule of man says, I've got the authority, and therefore I'm going to take this action that will benefit me. That's the rule of man. Okay? And most of the world functions according to the rule of man. See, the rule, countries may have laws on the books, but laws on the books don't make the world go round. What makes the world go round is whether people abide by those laws or not. Okay? So it's much more common, in other countries. I mean, if you go to another country and authorities in other countries like to pick on Americans because they think Americans have more money than almost anyone else. And so if you're driving a fancy car and it's obvious that you're an American, chances are you're going to get stopped, regardless of whether you abide by the law or not. That's just the fact of life. See, what is the basis of the rule of law? Secure property rights. See, you may own a home, or your parents may own a home, own a house. Well, how can they say, I own this house? Well, they can say that because they paid for it and they've got a piece of paper saying that they own this house, and the laws of the land will back up that assertion. Okay? But when you really think about it, what enables someone to say, I own this? Well, what enables someone to say, I own this, is law. The rule of law. Okay? And under the rule of law, we have property rights. You can say, this is mine, and that's yours. Okay? But we can only do that if we have the rule of law that defines and supports secure property rights. See, how does the rule of law and the rule of man relate to growth in Japan? Now, I remember reading an article once. It was called The Economic Miracle. And, Japan, for all practical purposes, there's a big rock stuck out in the ocean, because Japan has very little natural resources. And after World War II, Japan was damaged a lot. So you've got a country here that's decimated by a war, living on a big rock in the middle of the ocean, and in a few short years, within 10, 15 years, it becomes an economic world powerhouse. How in the world did Japan do that? And many economists look at that and say, that is an economic miracle. Well, here's how they did it. What they did is, right after the war, Japan passed laws rewarding savers. If you saved, you earned money, but you didn't spend it, and you saved it, therefore, then there were all kinds of, there were incentives for you. Many incentives, monetary incentives and other incentives. So Japan simply passed laws that encouraged and rewarded people who saved. Okay? And now, when this money is lent out to credit-worthy investors that are going to make good investments, then that's going to grow the economy. But is that what Japan did? No, that's not what Japan did. It got the first part of this equation right, but it got the second part wrong. What did Japan do? Well, Japan did what most of the world does. Because remember, America is one of the it's a country that lives according, in history, we've had a history of being a country that abides by the rule of law rather than the rule of man, but that's not the norm in the world. And what Japan did is that instead of lending money to the most creditworthy people, they lent money to favored persons. Who was a favored person? Well, it may have been a brother. People come to the bank and borrow money to make investments. Well, if you're part of the family, yeah, we'll lend you the money. Or maybe you're the one who gave the highest bribes to the loan officer, so you get the loan. See, there's all kinds of ways that we can decide who gets the money. There's not enough for everybody, so we got to decide who's going to get. And instead of the rule of law deciding who's going to get, like the most creditworthy person, the rule of man decide who gets, because it's all a part of the buddy system. If you're part of a favored group, then you get, but if you're not part of the favored group, then you don't get. But what happens? Well, this leads to what's called moral hazard. Japan has supported failing companies. See, moral hazard. If moral hazard is the concept we've talked about before, but moral hazard is that if certain groups are favored to the point where they know that if they mess up, they're not going to suffer the consequences, that they're going to be bailed out, then they're not going to be careful in the future. They're going to make reckless investments because, hey, why not? And that's what's happened in many countries like Japan. People who borrowed money were not the most creditworthy people. They made a lot of risky investments. Why risky? Well, the possibilities of return are higher, and it's more fun than safe investments. And hey, who cares? Because if I mess up, my brother, the banker, will simply take care of me. See? Well, that kind of society ultimately suffers poor economic growth. If you make investments based on the rule of man rather than making investments based on the rule of law, then you're building on quicksand. Y'all with me on this? See, moral hazard. Companies which are not allowed to fail will have the incentive to take huge risks. See, this is what happened back in America in 2007, 2008. There was mass business failures, and out of all the billions and billions of money that the government pumped into the economy, not one dime went to the average person who took out a mortgage. All the money went to big business. Okay? That's called moral hazard. Because today, in fact, we can learn more about this in later chapters, but we have actually written into law moral hazard. That we have actually legalized and written into law that the government is obligated to, say back in 2007, 2008, the government wasn't obligated, but now by law it's obligated to help out businesses who may make bad business decisions. Anyway, that's coming up in future chapters. Might find that interesting. What are the hindrances to growth? The rule of man dominates. See, instead of the rule of law, we've got the rule of man dominates. More business decisions than the rule of law. Excessive taxes can hinder growth, because if you're talking about economic growth, you're talking about making wise investments that's going to grow the economy, then history has taught us that the government is a poor investor. If you're looking for the transference of income and maybe helping the poor, well, government may be good at that. But if you're talking about investing in wisely, the government historically has not been very good at this. Money in the hands of of a prudent business person to make investments to grow the economy is a dollar more wisely spent than a dollar in the hands of the federal government. And so with excessive taxes, we have less money available to invest in the private sector. We've got more money in the public sector. Therefore, history has shown us that this is not good for long-term economic growth. Maybe good for other reasons, but not for growth. Excessive regulations fit into the same category. When we, all the hundreds of thousands and thousands of regulations that come down from Washington, D.C., there may be a good purpose with each of those regulations, but we're not talking here about all of the good reasons why we have government regulations. This chapter is on what? This chapter is on growth, economic growth. And if you're simply looking at growth, then the more regulations you have, the more difficult it is for the investor to make investments, and the slower growth you're going to have. Okay? We're being strangled, and again, we got, in later chapters we look at this in great detail, but there's a wonderful book. In my textbook I highlight 40 different books. You might have noticed that. But out of those 40, one of my favorite is one that you get right in chapter 12, and that's called The Rule of Nobody by Philip Howard. And he really hits the nail on the head and talks about how excessive government regulations has led to slow growth. And he does an excellent job with it. But we are really living in a regulation nightmare that has increased exponentially over the past 5, 10, 15 years. Yeah, you got a question?
No.
No.
Sorry.
Just stretching, huh? And the large national debt hinders growth because a lot of this money that the government owes, for one thing, is owed to foreigners, so that's just money that leaves the country. And we as Americans work hard, we pay taxes, and then our government sends our money to foreign countries because we borrowed money from those foreign countries. We're the largest debtor nation in the world by far, and our national debt is increasing tremendously every year, and it's almost $20 trillion now. And in the book I explain how much a trillion is, but it's almost unimaginable. And so the more of our resources that we put into paying off our national debt is that much fewer resources we have to make investments. If you spend $1 servicing debt, then that's $1 that you don't have to invest. And the less we have to invest, then the slower economic growth is. See, what is the key to growth? Increased productivity, which is what I'm going to talk about next. So hopefully next slide I'll define what this is. How can consumers buy things? Okay, well, I don't. Sometimes I don't know what's coming up on these slides, but increased productivity. What does that mean, increased productivity? Well, when we increase productivity, that means that outputs exceed inputs. So if we put in 5 units but get back 8 units, then that's an increase in productivity. That's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is that if we can produce more goods and services per unit of time at a lower per unit cost, then we have increased productivity. If we can produce more at lower costs then we have increased productivity. So it's the same thing as saying that, outputs exceed inputs. But only through an increase in productivity can we grow the economy. No matter how you cut the cake, if you don't increase productivity, you're not going to grow the economy. So how can consumers buy things at reasonable prices? Competition whereby lower costs will lead to lower prices and more profit. This is where, again, there are very few absolutes, but this is pretty close to being an absolute here, and that is that if we increase productivity, ultimately everyone benefits. If productivity subsides, then ultimately everyone suffers. Now that's pretty much of an absolute statement, truism. Now, how does that work? And I think I've explained this before, but let me go over it again very briefly. But let's say all of us here were in the same industry. We're all producers, and we're all in the same industry. And to begin with, let's say that our costs are the same, and we're all charging the same price. Let's say we're making widgets, and let's say it costs us, $6 to make a widget, and we're all selling these widgets for $1. And to make things simple, we all share the same portion of the market. In other words, our share of the market is pretty much equal. So y'all get this simplification. We're all in the same industry. Our costs are the same. Our price is the same. Share of the market is the same. Okay? Costs us, what did I say, $6 to make a widget? Now, you come along and you, through inventions or innovations, lower your costs of making this widget to, let's say, $2. Now, what has happened to your profit? Well, your profits increased, correct? Your costs have gone down. You're making more money per widget. Your costs have increased. But here is the major question. The question now is, how can you increase your profits even more so? And the answer to that question is, you lower your price. Because lower prices lead to higher profits. Assuming that you lower your costs first. Okay? So what's going to happen? Well, let's see. I say that to begin with, it costs us $6 to make this widget. Let's say that you lower your price to $4. Now, you're making the same thing as the rest of us. If we're all charging, what did I say, $10? Whatever I said. If we're all charging $10, then why would somebody buy from you instead of, why should anybody buy from the rest of us instead of buying from you? Because we're making the same thing. But you're charging $4, the rest of us are charging $10. Well, most everyone will buy from you. Now, let's say the rest of us say, oh, well, you're selling for $4. Let's lower our price to $4. Well, can we do that? No, we can't do that. Why? Well, because it costs us $4 to make a widget. If we charge $4 and it costs us $4 to make the widget, we'd all go broke. See, why could you charge $4? Because you lowered your cost to $2. See what I mean? Well, okay, now, what choices do we have? We all have the same two choices. Either we get off our duff and compete with you and lower our costs and then lower our price, or we go out of business. Those are only two choices. Either we do what you did or we go out of business. Now, why does everyone benefit from this? Well, everyone benefits from this because if a business lowers costs and then lowers price, they increase sales and they make more profit. Just like, I mentioned this before, Sam Walton and Walmart. Sam was always looking for ways to lower costs. Then what did he do? He lowered prices. And what happened? Well, Walmart became the major retailer in the world. How come? Because of lower prices. But could they lower prices if they did not lower costs first? No. The whole point was to lower cost and then lower prices. All right? Now, with lower prices, you and I buy more because our buying power is increased as consumers. So as we buy more, business sells more, and they need more resources, and one resource they need more of is labor. So now we got more jobs. All right? The money's making more money, so they can pay higher wages. So look what we've got here. We've got economic growth, we got more jobs, business making more money, the workers making higher wages, the government's making higher taxes. I mean, they're bringing in more tax revenues because of the booming economy, and everybody wins. It's a win-win situation. I mean, the only ones that lose here are the ones that couldn't play the game as well as the rest, perhaps. The businesses that couldn't lower their costs or were unwilling to lower their costs and were unwilling to lower their prices, and maybe they went out of business. But I mean, those that are willing to play the game, I mean, everyone benefits. This is what brings about economic growth. Okay? That's what productivity does. Unfortunately, the opposite is true. If we raise costs, if we let our machines get old, if we don't continually invest in new plants and equipment, our machines get old, they deteriorate, they become less efficient, etc., etc. If we don't grow and our costs start to increase, then instead of prices decreasing, prices will have to increase. Buying power goes down, people buy less, business sells less, they need fewer workers, and now we have a downward spiral. So if you increase productivity, almost everyone benefits, but when productivity suffers, almost everyone is hurt. Everyone suffers. Now that's almost an absolute, not quite, because there are exceptions, but the point here I'm making is that what is the key to long-term economic growth? And the answer is to increase productivity. Okay, well that's a good place to stop, and it is time to go. So I will finish up this chapter 3 next time. See you all next time.